Hello everyone, this is Anshuman and with me I have my colleague Siddharth. Welcome to this knowledge sharing session hosted by Aranca. Aranca is a global technology advisory firm and we help organizations accelerate innovation. Today we have with us Dr. Hemang Shah, and Himang is a senior technology leader with Qualcomm. He has a vast amount of expertise with dealing with IP, dealing with licensing, dealing with startups. And we welcome Himang to our show today so that he can share insights which will be beneficial for the startup ecosystem at large. Himang, welcome to the show. And would be really great if you can talk a little bit more about your background, maybe introduce yourself.
Yeah, Anshuman, Siddharth, Aranka, thank you for having me. Hey, everyone who's listening. So, I am Himang. I come from a traditional business family who has made his way into the world of engineering. So, my family business was textiles into the wholesale markets, but I was deeply interested in science and technology. And over the years, I've ultimately, studied engineering, got a doctorate, and worked for a high-tech, semiconductor company. And one of the things that I really enjoy about my work is I work with startups. I get to help them, I work on their products alongside them, help them innovate, and importantly, mentor them on their IP strategy. And this field is so fascinating and so evolving that I've been fortunate to play a small part in their journey. And overall, if I look at my experience both in the US and India, it's an amazing ecosystem that I find myself, blessed to be in. So thank you for having me here.
Absolutely, Himang. So, Himang, since you do, a lot of work with startups, let's start from there maybe. And maybe you want to talk about what actually defines success for startups.
Yeah. So Anshuman, when you look at a startup, I think rather than looking at success, which can be an endpoint, I prefer looking at the origin of why a startup came into existence. And in my experience, a startup is always found by a deep dissatisfaction. Like the founders, the CTOs, they are unhappy with how a product is functioning today, something which is in the market, or they have spotted a need which is not being met, or if it is being met, it's met in a very substantial manner, and they feel that they can overcome it, through either their innovative approach, which is either through technology, it could be a business model, or it could be a new way of operating in the market that they have discovered. Essentially, they've found an edge. So to me, the startups that do well are the ones that figure out how to maintain that edge over a long time, how to protect it, how to protect their innovations, and secondly, how can they maximize their rewards. So the success, I would say, comes from looking at the quality of the problem that they have identified and the solution, right, which is how they are able to, really maintain this technological or their business edge for a long period of time.
Right. And Hemang, given that your experience is very global in nature, you've worked in the US, you've worked in India, you also are actively involved in the African startup ecosystem, right? Do you see any difference in the innovation that is coming out from Indian startups as opposed to startups from other geographies, especially if you look at the US startups?
Yes, a few years ago, there was a remarkable difference.
Mhm.
And I think the genesis goes into, let's say, the kind of population India presents versus America. India, we know, is densely populated. But interestingly, at every strata of the population, you have a substantial market. So if you look at a population which is, let's say, uh, if you break it up in terms of income, across every low, middle class, or the premium economy, you have a fair amount of market size. So you would see a lot of marketplace innovations. You will see a lot of thriving trading opportunities that I at least have seen growing up. And that's how a number of the Indian entrepreneurs started looking at opportunities that India was providing them. But now I'm seeing a shift where they are turning more and more towards deep tech. And this was one area where US actually started, or the Western world started first, for a variety of their reasons. Because labor is not accessible over there. The size of the country is so huge that it's not feasible to move things, let's say, at a very fast distance. So they had to resort to technology just to maintain some product edge. Uh, in India, for example, a number of let's say your delivery startups and all that, the way they function here, if you apply the exact same model out in the Western worlds, they may not work as well as they do here. So, but India started borrowing from the West, which is rather looking at the best practices over there, seeing that hey, if you focus more towards deep tech, then you can maintain this edge that you've spotted for a much longer period of time. So I think now we are seeing the shift, and you'll see more and more deep tech startups emerge from India.
Right. And, taking that point further, how important for a startup is it to have a completely new offering, right? Can a startup which just has like an incremental improvement over an existing solution, can they win?
If the solution is just an incremental advancement, and to, I guess, introduce that in the market, if price is the only factor, then I think it has a limited, shelf life, because soon enough, the incumbents will be, catching up very fast. And any incremental advancement uh, is only like you're just probably one step away from who's behind you. So instead of that, if you look at what is going to give you a fundamental new offering, that will of course give you a much larger lead time compared to the others. But the factor over there is how well can you scale it. Now, I'm not saying that with incremental there is absolutely no chance, because you see plenty of again, look at the market, look at the number of, let's say, tea shops which open up. Someone cracks a new market, and whether it's a food business offering, and you see others that enter the same area, same marketplace, and they're all able to thrive. So if you are able to get such wonderful opportunities through business model, through the way you arrange your economics, it is possible to survive. But if you want that long term, that kind of ROI which makes a startup so successful, that is not possible in my opinion with an incremental advancement.
Understood.
Yeah, Hemang. So, coming to the other part of the story, wherein how important do you feel is IP strategy for Indian startups?
Very important. In the past few years, it has become even more and more apparent for a variety of reasons. See, our startups and the entrepreneurs were cognizant about intellectual property, but I would say largely it was limited to trademarks. But in the past few years, we have seen a remarkable rise in terms of the number of patents which are being filed by startups. And when it comes to tech startups in particular, the patents are a more valuable form of IP rights. Others are also important, but patents give them a much stronger edge. So we are now seeing an era where if you look at, let's say, the patents filed by startups, and this is reporting from the India Patent Office, you'll almost see like a hockey stick curve. So on one side, it's clear that there is a deep belief in the protection of their innovations.
Right.
But the other side is we have also seen a number of startups that have received good exits because of their patent portfolio, their IP portfolio overall, but patents were a key factor because these were tech startups. We have also seen cases where VCs are also making their decisions on the quality of patent portfolio. So IP strategy is going to be an important asset, particularly if you want to be a player for the long term.
Okay. So I'll just step back a bit and ask you, like, do corporates also see um, the patents coming from startups as an in-licensing opportunity?
From a personal viewpoint, yes, I've seen that. I've seen as a good collaboration opportunity between startups and corporates. Now, they may not always, have an IP as a forefront way of, say, licensing it. It may be a problem that a large corporation wants to solve, and a startup is a good collaborator. And but therein, if there is protection backed by IP, then it makes things, clearer from a certain viewpoint. So absolutely, we are seeing a number of collaborations between corporations of all sizes and startups. But over time, I foresee more and more of that to happen.
All right. So, according to you, what strategy should startups follow in order to scale alongside driving innovation? So, both the things are very important for startups too. thrive, right?
So that's a very difficult problem. Particularly if you look at it from a startup's lens, because they've taken, let's say, so much of time looking at how to innovate, how to create their new product offering in the first place. So that was a deep journey into innovation, product readiness, and getting it out to market. So now they have, let's say, proved to themselves that there is a product market fit. That is a skill set which is very different than the skill set required to scale it. And to do it both when a team is very small can be challenging, because you got to have founders, you got to have their technical team and
Right.
everyone to be capable to switching between the two. Because sometimes when you innovate, you're not thinking of scale. When you may want to have an innovation to just get one prototype up and running. When you scale, you may be thinking thousands or millions rather.
Right.
They both require different lenses. So it can be a very challenging problem. But the ones that are doing it well, they do it at a phase where they've grown up substantially in size, that they can sort of compartmentalize the two, or at least have distinct functions which say, okay, at this stage we focus more on scaling, and a small team, let's say, may focus on innovation, and vice versa. So I think you got to have both. You can't say that I'm only going to do one and not the other, but it requires different mental capacities.
Right. And I mean, interesting that we talk about IP and startups, especially in the Indian context. So, do you think the legal framework is conducive enough in terms of enforceability that IP becomes a critical factor for a startup's success?
At a personal level, absolutely. It always has been, and in the past few years, it has become even stronger, in my opinion. So, I think as a country, we are making a dramatic rise in the innovation index rankings, and the value of protection, the value of let's say fighting for your IP rights also is one of the key factors over there. So, yeah, by all means, we are heading in that right direction.
Right. And say for a startup which is operating out of India, or let's say for a startup which is innovating from India, right? Uh, I would imagine that IP literacy is not that great as we would want it to be. So, do you think that startup founders should already start thinking about filing IP abroad when they launch a startup in India, or should that come at a later stage?
It's a very good question, Anshuman, and this is something that we discuss quite a bit with every startup, because what we see is that, and this is where you're spot on, is that they are innovating in India and they are spotting, let's say, an opportunity. So, for example, there's a med tech startup which is looking at diagnosing a particular disease, and they're like, I see this disease in my surroundings, wherever they are based, and they innovate for India. They launch their first product in India, but there's a very good chance that there are others around the world who are also suffering from that issue, and their product would be helpful to them. And so very naturally, we are seeing a number of startups, exporting out of India. So they're entering other markets. So getting intellectual property protection in all those countries becomes ultra important. Even if they don't want to, let's say, have their own operations in those countries, they may want to partner with someone. Having IP rights in those countries also enables that. Right? So having a global IP strategy is absolutely important. Now, how do you drive the awareness? And I think this is where we've been doing a fair amount of workshops. At the government level also, there are a number of initiatives like the CPAM and the NEPAM initiatives, which are providing IP awareness to startups. Yes, we need a fair amount of work to be done, but I'm very, very happy with the kind of growth in IP awareness and IP filing that we are seeing in the country. Like, believe me, from 10 years ago, we've come a far away, far long distance.
Right. Hemang, you mentioned deep tech.
Yeah.
Do you want to, elaborate more on what exactly is deep tech, and how is it different from regular tech?
So this is one of those things where you're like, hey, what does deep tech mean to me? And to me, deep tech means an area where you are fundamentally innovating on a technical domain. Uh, Instead of integrating known pieces, you are diving deep into exploring a vertical. So, for example, you might be innovating around new semiconductor materials that may help the power efficiency. Now, the gestation time for such projects can be longer because until and unless you're able to, let's say, do the research on that material set, until and unless you're able to get the initial lab results that prove that, yes, your hypothesis and your experimental results have a good correlation. And later on, proving that the material set can be manufactured at scale and delivered, you will be in that gestation period. So deep tech means working on those areas. When it comes to, these days generative AI is the big hottest topic everyone is curious about. Look at the amount of time that fundamental model development companies spent in training and gathering the data sets and in researching, making sure that these models, when being prompted, will deliver the outputs that will be acceptable to us. Until they came out in the market, there was a fair amount of work that went on for years behind the scenes. So deep tech to me means firstly spotting the fundamental research opportunities and then spending that amount of time. And this is one of those areas where the world may tell you that, hey, you're way too early for this thing, or there's no market for this. It's living, under that cloud on your head, but yet, chugging away at it until it becomes mainstream, and then it will eventually transition into a regular tech product.
Right. And you said that Indian ecosystem is moving more towards deep tech now. So do you want to talk a little bit more about that and how that is happening? What kind of trends are we seeing?
Yeah, so a number of them. I mean, one of the areas that we see a lot of startups are the ones who are solving for the healthcare using medical technologies. So India has a good amount of, let's say, research which is being done in the biotech area. But number of that work, let's say, may just be pure biology. But when you marry it with technology like IoT, you're getting amazing opportunities. You're getting people that are bringing the value of that kind of research onto devices. And that is helping people, at scale so that someone is able to walk with those devices in rural areas and help, doctors, make better diagnosis, make faster diagnosis. So on one side, we have things like those. On the other side, let's say the world is looking at, let's say, cars, for example, or electric cars, and we absolutely need that. But we have a number of our consumers who prefer two-wheelers or three-wheelers, and they're all going to be electric. They're all turning more electric. So how do you get better charging points? How do you get better batteries for them? Whether it's battery swapping, because our country may be the one where you will have deployments which require swappable batteries as well as battery charging stations. We are a population that's always in a hurry. So I don't want to always spend 2 hours waiting for my battery to be recharged. But if I can swap it out, at a swap station, then I might prefer that. So how do those batteries work? How do the material set of that works? Space and drones are another domain where we have worked with startups. We've seen startups that are developing long distance drones that have a flight time of more than hundreds plus kilometers to deliver payloads, for critical things such as, medicines, or during COVID times, it was, how do they deliver swabs? So in all these verticals, you are seeing startups that are waiting to do the hard work of say proving their approach. Maybe it takes 3 years, 5 years, but eventually they do bring it out to the market.
Right. And with that, I guess the appetite of investors would also be changing, right?
It is changing. It is changing, and we are seeing a lot more support for these kind of startups. I mean, I think when I started interacting with the Indian startups back in 2016 or so, you saw mostly marketplace of fintech startups that were always gathering the funding news. But now we are seeing a greater appetite for these kind of deep tech startups also. And it's an absolute apart from the funding, which is vital for the startups. More than that, it's the belief that hey, someone who's a seasoned investor also believes in this thing, that it can be successful from a financial viewpoint also. So it's not just a technical validation that they're getting,
Right.
it's that business and financial validation, which is also deeply important. If you want a strong entrepreneur base, then they got to be both technically sound, but they also have to believe that, yes, with these kind of deep tech investments, it can be financially worth it also.
Right. And that gets me thinking, right? if we are looking at innovation from a long term horizon, we're looking at deep tech, fundamental innovation, which can essentially impact the way things operate, right? Universities and government research institutions would also have a big role to play in that. Do you have any insights on, what roles can universities play, and then how can they help enable uh, deep tech?
Yeah. Anshuman, universities are the right starting point for any fundamental research work. That's where, you know, every researcher that you pick, most of them would tend to have a deep research background, whether it's working on, let's say, their master's thesis or doctoral thesis, or later on. The origin point of most of these, you can trace it back to the university. And the university is the appropriate seeding ground for such kind of research work. And I'm happy to say that many universities that I engage with, they have e-cells, they have these tech transfer organizations. Like last weekend, I was at a tech transfer conference, which was set up in a university in Bangalore. So they are talking of, hey, we are working on many of these research areas, and now we want to transfer these technologies not just to larger companies, but to whoever that wants to borrow them and build businesses out of them. Now, this was the structure which I had seen like in the American mindset, or sorry, this was a structure which I had seen in the American university system. If you look at most universities there, they have what is called as an Office of Research and Commercialization, which means the research work that is done by the professors or the students is provided to, let's say, people to adopt. If you are a student, you may get to adopt it at a more favorable terms. But if you're an outsider, you're also welcome. The terms may be slightly different. But if you do that, then the university will provide you additional resources. You will get face time with the professors and the students. You may get seating facilities. If you want lab access, the universities will provide that. So we are seeing this change happen in India also. So fully agree that universities will be fundamentally important for our deep tech environment to flourish.
Absolutely. And we've talked about deep tech, we've talked about e-commerce startups. There are a lot of SaaS startups which have come out from India. Some of them are incredibly successful as well, and they've found their audience in Western countries. We always talk about this concept of make in India for India, but then there's also this concept of make in India for the rest of the world. So, do you have any thoughts on that? Making in India for the rest of the world.
Anshuman, we are seeing that.
Yeah.
We are seeing it has been our strength for decades now. I mean, and a good credit of this, of course, goes to our IT and our software industry, where we not only have the talent and the expertise, but we also found this ability to understand what the client requirements are, what the customer requirements are, and meeting those. So that culture has always been there. And apart from that, what it is seeding, I think that is the more interesting part. It is that has become our strength to identify what the market needs and can we deliver. So on the execution front, I think Indians are generally very strong. Now, when it comes to, let's say, marrying those talents and taking it to other verticals, be it software as a service, where you may have to create a more product mindset, where fine, the last S in SaaS stands for service, but you are creating a software product for it to function first. So we are creating this product, and I think we have enough of a critical mass now also that people believe we can do that. And we are seeing this translate into the hardware, into the edge AI startups also. So you're seeing this how success in one domain is now seeding many of these other successes to happen.
Absolutely. And do you think as we export software, SaaS products out of India, policy is conducive for such export?
So I don't work too much on the software side of things, but looking at how the government has been encouraging a lot of these other verticals, be it any tech, you look at electronics and IT, if you look at, let's say, hardware, and soon enough you'll see a lot of, the rise of semiconductors from the country. I think you have the environment which is being primed for a lot of this activity to flourish. Now it is up to us, up to the ecosystem that takes advantage of this. It does require all of us to work together. But I'm very confident that yeah, this will happen.
Yeah. So on the part of Make in India for India and Make in India for the world, right? So there is a difference in the Indian market and the Western market, right? So there has to be a strategic shift while making a product for the India market as well as for the Western market, right? So how should Indian startups cater to that problem of initially strategizing their um, towards India market or initially strategizing towards the Western market? So how should it be
Yeah.
for
So
the Indian markets?
Siddharth, what you ask for is is a very important question in any innovation and a strategy journey, and that is what is the problem you're solving, and very closely tied with that is who are you solving for.
Right.
And there are cultural nuances. There will be let's say pricing nuances. So let's say if I have to sell a product in India, it can be as simple as a vada pav. It has to be priced a certain way for the Indian market to pick it up.
Right.
My pricing for that can be very different when I go to the Western world. So I have to really look at who is it that I'm solving for and what is their deepest pain point. And I have to also be cognizant of where the maximum resources I have at my disposal are. They in one country versus the rest? If I'm going to be based here, if my team is based here, if I have the depth of my understanding to be for the Indian context, I will only focus here. And only once I've proven that this can work here. And generally, what I've seen is that if something can work in the Indian context, you can take it anywhere else in the world and it will work as well.
India is a more complicated market than the rest of the world.
Correct.
Right.
If you can make it work with regards to whatever, it could be an environmental thing, it could be, let's say, a pricing thing,
Right.
it could be solving for scale. If you can prove it here, chances are very good that it will work elsewhere. But if you have innovated for, let's say, a Western market or a very niche market, then you may have to find your work in adapting it. And don't just adapt it for the sake that, hey, I'm now entering a new market. It has to be backed by your research on your customer and their strongest pain point.
Right. So just shifting a bit on the aspect of corporate governance. So how do you think how much important is corporate governance for Indian startups? In the initial area, in initial time, like initial 2 years, 3 years, how do they actually give importance to corporate governance?
It's not something that they can ignore. But at the start, I can understand why they may not be focused towards it, because they're like, hey, we just want to focus on the deep problem that that we want to target, we want to address the market and so on. But far too many times I've seen that a startup scales very rapidly, and when you are a team of two, corporate governance may not seem that much of a problem. But very fast, that team of two will be a team of 200. And if they've not spent any time thinking about this, then it's too late. So, how do they address this? And I think this is where they've got to work with advisors on the board. Hopefully, they have mentors. Even if they don't have investors who've become, let's say, board members, they work with advisors who can say, okay, I think it is time that now we start focusing on these important matters, such as have a governing structure in place, have an HR mindset, because again, this is one of those areas where I see startups scramble, because they've scaled too rapidly and they're like, hey, I need someone to help me in this domain. So they can't ignore it. The reality is such, and they can learn from the ones that did not pay heed to it and say that, okay, these are mistakes that could have been avoided, and this is what we will do so that we don't find ourselves in the same spot.
The inherent DNA of a startup, I believe, is move fast, break things, be agile, and I guess startup founders are always worried about product. They're worried about marketing, sales, but sometimes they tend to ignore the governance part of it. I believe that is equally important. Maybe the third leg on which.
Very much so, Anshuman. Fully agree with that. And my advice, to the startups has been for areas like these, which are not on your radar every single day. Insert a calendar review. Put a block on your calendar. It can be a half an hour thing, for example, to start with. Put that every month that you're going to think about this. And this has to come from the founders. Because if the leadership does not believe that, then I don't think the rest of the organization will follow. So the leaders have to set the tone and the priorities from the get-go. And it starts by them saying that, okay, we are going to review this thing on a monthly basis or a bi-monthly basis, whatever frequency makes sense for them.
And especially if a startup has global aspirations, right, it becomes even more important because
Yeah. And that's where you see a big difference in how, let's say, a Western startup is constructed versus, let's say, some of the Asian ones that, that may have those structures,
Right.
be set over time. And I think this is again one of those areas where it's not that in the West the startup founders are necessarily thinking like that. It's the ecosystem is telling them that, hey, you better have this in place, else you can't run a long distance. So this message to our startups can also come from the ecosystem.
right.
Right. And also in the deep tech space, do you feel talent is a problem in India?
No, talent has never been a problem in the country because, face it, we love science, we love engineering, we love math. I mean, take anyone, I mean, these are natural areas for us. I think what we lacked were opportunities and in the startups. So what I'm pleasantly surprised to see is that so many college graduates are looking at startups as their aspirational job, which is so different than, let's say, when so I used to be the placement coordinator for my university back in the day. And at that time none of us ever thought of working for a startup.
Right.
I mean, not because we had many were like no, we'll prefer this larger company. Is that there were no options like that, and now the situation is so different. So it's not a talent thing. It's a talent base which is waiting for the opportunity.
And how do you see the startups ecosystem evolving in next 5 years or 3 years for that matter in the technology? What technologies do you foresee coming in and what startup?
So, so everything. So I'm deeply involved in the electronics, semiconductor side of things. So I think that is going to flourish because we have the right building blocks. But looking at the overall economy also growing. If you look at infrastructure, we have such a large infrastructure. We have amazing opportunities for servicing those. We have amazing waterways. We have rivers, lakes. So apart from the aerial drones, we've seen a number of startups that are developing underwater drones, for surveillance applications, for inspection use cases, sometimes for even doing mapping of the waterways. So you'll see startups like that flourish. We have space, which is coming up as an amazing sector. Like India is going to be doing a fair amount of work in launching satellites, and you'll have startups that will be deploying payloads. Some of them will be innovating in this area. We have seen many startups that have already taken advantage of that.
Right.
So it's almost like take any sector you're looking at. So the good thing is it's a right time to actually be involved in this domain. Even if you're not a startup founder, be involved in our ecosystem.
Absolutely.
Right.
Right. So let's move on to some advice for startups, given your vast experience working with startups globally, um, and maybe we'll take it up point by point. So, how important do you think is it to have a very structured roadmap right at the offset, right when you have an idea? How important is it to have a roadmap?
It's important to have a general direction of where you want to go, but having a rigid structure may not be required because chances are it will change. So rather than that, I say focus more on the exact problem space you're after, and have a sense of what your solution offering should look like, but pay more and more attention towards your target market, what their pain points are. I think you have to innovate for that.
Right, and we've seen startups pivot quite a lot, and then
Yeah.
they find the right fit, right?
Correct.
Absolutely. And then how important is it to understand what your competition is doing? It can be large companies, it can be other small startups.
It's important to know to see what they are up to, how they are innovating, what their offerings are, and in some sense, what can be your differentiating elements. But I won't say you have to keep looking at them. And if it's a startup which is working in the deep tech space, then I think the problem space itself will give them enough to focus on. It's when they get to the market and all that. Fine, it's always helpful to see who you're running with in a race. but ultimately you have to run your own race.
Right.
Right. And for a startup founder, right, where should they start from? Should they start from the customer, identify the problem, and then bring it back to the technology? Or should they start from technology and then see where it can fit?
I've seen the customer approach making its way into technology as a better route, because that way you have identified a problem, and then you're finding the best tool, and technology can be an amazing enabler, to servicing that problem. If you start with the other way around, you could be a solution looking for a problem,
Right.
and that may not be productive.
Right. And how important do you think is mentorship for a startup?
Very much so. They always need a sounding board, because you know we all, like, our vision is limited. We always see what's in front of us. We all have our blind spots. We all have things that we are not trained for into naturally looking at. So having a mentor that is not afraid to show you that, hey, you're missing out this opportunity, or you're not looking at this factor, I think that's a crucial element. And every startup, leadership team needs to have a pool of mentors. Not, just one mentor won't cut it. You may start with one, but you need to have a mentor that will, shine the light for different areas.
Right. And how do you find these mentors?
Uh, you have to find them by networking. You have to look at who has done it before, or who has operated in a similar domain that I can now approach for counsel. And they have to be someone whose counsel you respect. If you don't respect your mentors, if you feel that, yes, this person is talented, but I'm not finding myself to respect him, then it's no use to get that person on board. You have to be willing to listen and carry out those actions. Uh, so a startup, I think, should actually make a request to either fellow startup founders that, who do you approach when you're in a jam. They may ask their investors that, can you recommend someone? And over time, as founders especially, they'll be out at various events. They'll be out at pitching events, at networking events. So that's where they can put their radar on that. Okay, who do they find, that, hey, this person thinks differently in a way that we are not.
Do venture capital firms have a role to play when it comes to mentorship, or is their role only to infuse capital?
I have seen, I can't answer for all the VCs, but the ones that I've seen play an active role into guiding the startup. Because ultimately, yes, they are infusing capital, and they do want a return on their investment. That is, a fundamental objective, for a VC firm. And one of the enabling elements to ensure that success is to make sure the startup is on the right path. So number of VCs I know, they have that talent base across, within their own team to provide this guidance. But if not, I've also seen VCs who are approaching other people that, hey, as a founder, you should talk to this person, get this person on board, because it's a win-win, right? If a startup wins, then the VC will win.
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
And I think, as parting thoughts, what is the general overall advice that you would have for somebody who's starting up in India and wants to make a product for the world? What advice would you have?
Pay very close attention to the kind of problem you're picking. Be very, very judicious before you start developing a solution. And once you found an edge, find a way to secure and protect it. And ultimately, you have to maximize that edge.
Excellent. Thank you so much,
Thank you.
Hemang, for this wonderful session today. And thanks for all the knowledge that you shared with us. And stay tuned for more episodes with Aranca. Thanks.
Sure. Thank you, Siddharth. Thank you, Anshuman. And thanks, Aranca, for having me over.
Thank you.
Thank you, Himang.
Hope you found the session insightful. Stay tuned for more such episodes with Aranca.